What if I told you that one of music's most comforting anthems was born from a mother's ghost and became the soundtrack to rock's most bitter divorce? A song written as a whisper of hope became a weapon of destruction. Studio sessions where cameras captured every cruel word and broken friendship. The song that was meant to heal instead tore the Beatles apart forever, yet transformed their ending into eternal legend. The summer of love was over, and for the Beatles, the endless party had become an endless nightmare. By 1968, the four lads from Liverpool, who had conquered the world, were drowning in their own success, and the cracks that had been carefully hidden from public view were becoming impossible to ignore. The beginning of the end can be traced to a single, devastating moment in August 1967. Brian Epstein, their manager, and the man who had guided them from Hamburg's seedy clubs to global superstardom, was found dead from a drug overdose in his London home. Epstein hadn't just been their business manager, he had been their father figure, their protector, and most importantly, the diplomatic buffer between four increasingly volatile personalities. Without Brian's steadying hand, the delicate ecosystem of the Beatles began to collapse. Paul McCartney, ever the perfectionist and the most business-minded of the group, stepped into the leadership void. His intentions were pure, but his execution was catastrophic. The other three Beatles, John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, began to resent what they saw as Paul's patronizing control. Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. The creative harmony that had defined their partnership was giving way to something much darker. During the chaotic sessions for what would become known as the White Album, the four men, who had once shared everything, found themselves working in separate studios, each pursuing their own artistic vision. Paul was gravitating toward mainstream pop sensibilities. John was diving deep into experimental soundscapes with his new artistic muse, Yoko Ono, and George was exploring the spiritual depths of Indian music and philosophy. George Harrison's frustration ran deeper than creative differences. His songwriting had matured dramatically since the mid-1960s, but his contributions were consistently overshadowed or outright rejected by the dominant Lennon-McCartney partnership. Songs that would later become classics were dismissed in favor of what George saw as inferior material. The man who would write Something and Here Comes the Sun was being treated like a session musician in his own band. The tensions weren't just musical, they were deeply personal. Ringo Starr, feeling completely alienated from the creative process, actually quit the band for several weeks during the White Album sessions. He returned only after his bandmates begged him to come back, but the damage to the group's unity was irreversible. John Lennon's relationship with Yoko Ono added another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. While popular mythology has painted Yoko as the villain who broke up the Beatles, the reality was far more nuanced. Her constant presence in the studio wasn't the cause of the band's problems, it was a symptom of John's growing desire to break free from the confines of the group that had defined his entire adult life. As their personal relationships crumbled, so did their business empire. Apple Corps, the Beatles' ambitious but chaotically managed company, was hemorrhaging money at an alarming rate, an estimated £50,000 per week by late 1968. This financial crisis forced them into a search for new management, which would prove to be the final nail in their coffin. Paul wanted to hire his father-in-law, Lee Eastman, a respected New York entertainment lawyer. The other three Beatles, however, were drawn to Alan Klein, an aggressive American accountant who promised to solve their financial problems. Paul's distrust of Klein was visceral and immediate, especially after Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones warned him about Klein's dubious business practices. The appointment of Alan Klein as their manager was more than a business decision, it was a declaration of war. It cemented the deep-seated mistrust between Paul and his three bandmates, and set the stage for the legal battles and public acrimony that would define their breakup. In the midst of this emotional and financial chaos, Paul McCartney was feeling more isolated than ever. The burden of trying to hold the band together was crushing him, and for the first time in his charmed life, the eternal optimist was drowning in anxiety and despair.
Speaking words of wisdom, let it be.
It was during this dark period in late 1968 that Paul experienced something that would change not only his life, but the course of popular music. In a dream that felt more real than waking life, he was visited by his mother Mary, who had died of cancer when he was just 14 years old. In the dream, Mary appeared to him looking beautiful and radiant, offering him a simple but profound message of comfort. "It'll be all right, just let it be." The feeling of peace that washed over him was so intense that when he awakened, he immediately reached for his guitar and began working on a song based on the experience. The song that emerged from this spiritual encounter was unlike anything Paul had written before. Let It Be was deeply personal, yet universally resonant. A gentle hymn that seemed to channel both his grief for his mother and his anguish over the disintegration of his band. Paul was aware that the reference to Mother Mary would be interpreted by many as a religious allusion to the Virgin Mary, and he was comfortable with that ambiguity. As he later explained, if a song carried a positive message of hope and acceptance, he believed it was worth putting out into the world, regardless of how people chose to interpret it. Interestingly, there's an alternate origin story that adds another layer of complexity to the song's creation. Malcolm Evans, the Beatles' longtime road manager, claimed that Paul had actually received the inspiration during a meditation session in India, where Evans himself appeared to Paul and delivered the simple message to "Let It Be." This version is supported by early rehearsal recordings where Paul can be heard singing "Brother Malcolm" instead of "Mother Mary," suggesting that the song's spiritual origins may have been even more complex than the widely accepted story. In January 1969, with their relationships at the breaking point, the Beatles embarked on what would become one of the most infamous projects in rock history. Paul McCartney, still desperately trying to save the band, proposed the Get Back Project, a return to their rock and roll roots that would be captured on film, culminating in a live concert performance. The concept seemed reasonable enough: set up cameras and microphones at Twickenham Film Studios and document the band writing and rehearsing new songs. What they captured instead was the painful, unfiltered documentation of four men who had forgotten how to collaborate. Their every argument and moment of tension preserved for posterity. The presence of cameras and microphones, combined with the unnaturally early start times that Paul had insisted upon, created a pressure cooker atmosphere that brought every simmering resentment to the surface. The footage revealed a band that had become accustomed to working in isolation during the White Album sessions, and they struggled to remember how to function as a unified creative unit. When Paul brought Let It Be into these volatile sessions, the response from his bandmates was telling. John Lennon was openly dismissive, later describing the entire Get Back experience as going through hell. He called the song granny music, the same derogatory term he used for Paul's other melodic compositions that he felt were too commercial and lightweight. Lennon's contempt for Let It Be ran deeper than musical taste. It was personal. He stated that the song had nothing to do with the Beatles and sounded like something Paul would later write for his post-Beatles band Wings. In a moment that perfectly illustrated his detachment from Paul's creative process, John even claimed the song was inspired by Simon and Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water, apparently unaware that Paul had written Let It Be months before the Simon and Garfunkel song was even recorded. The tensions came to a head in one of the most famous confrontations in rock history. Paul, trying to get the band to work more methodically, began telling George Harrison how to play his guitar parts. George, who had endured years of creative suppression, finally exploded. "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play it at all if you don't want me to play. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it." This wasn't just an argument about guitar parts. It was George's cry of frustration against years of being treated as a junior member of his own band. The confrontation was so intense that George walked out of the sessions entirely, staying away for 5 days and seriously considering never returning. The Get Back sessions, which were supposed to reunite the band creatively, instead became the final documentation of their collapse. Every cruel word, every moment of tension, every breakdown in communication was captured on film, creating a permanent record of rock's most painful divorce. When the band effectively broke up after the Get Back sessions, John Lennon and George Harrison made a decision that would add one final layer of bitterness to their dissolution. They brought in American producer Phil Spector, famous for his wall of sound technique, to salvage the chaotic tapes and turn them into a releasable album. Spector's approach was the antithesis of everything the Beatles had represented. Where their music had always been about subtle interplay and careful arrangement, Spector buried the songs under layers of orchestral and choral overdubs. His most controversial decision was his treatment of Let It Be itself, which he loaded with dramatic strings and gospel-style backing vocals. Paul McCartney was not consulted about these changes, and when he heard the results, he was furious. The gentle, intimate ballad he had written in memory of his mother had been transformed into something grandiose and overproduced. Spector's intervention, orchestrated by John and George without Paul's knowledge, was a deliberate act of creative spite, a final way to finish the album without his input. The differences between the two versions of Let It Be tell the complete story of the band's final months. The single version, produced by George Martin with a subtle, respectful touch, was released on March 6, 1970. The album version, heavy with Spector's orchestral additions, would follow 2 months later as the final track on what would be the Beatles' last studio album. The timing of the single's success created one of the most dramatic ironies in pop music history. On April 10, 1970, Let It Be was setting at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. On the exact same day, Paul McCartney released a self-interview with his solo album, McCartney, in which he announced that he was no longer working with the Beatles. The juxtaposition was cinematically perfect and heartbreakingly cruel. As fans around the world were celebrating the Beatles' latest chart topper, they were simultaneously learning that the band that had defined their youth was over forever. Let It Be, the song of comfort and acceptance, had become the soundtrack to the end of an era. Paul McCartney's public announcement made him the villain in the story of the Beatles' breakup, a role he would be forced to play for decades. The narrative was simple and devastating. Paul had torn apart the world's most beloved band out of ego and spite. But the truth, as it often is, was far more complicated. John Lennon had actually told the other Beatles that he was leaving the band in September 1969, 6 months before Paul's public announcement. However, John, along with manager Alan Klein, had agreed to keep the news secret for business reasons. Paul, frustrated by what he called the subterfuge and increasingly concerned about Klein's management of the band's finances, felt he had no choice but to reveal the truth. The man who had fought hardest to keep the Beatles together was forced to become the one to publicly announce their end. The final, most painful chapter began on December 31, 1970, when Paul filed a lawsuit to legally dissolve the Beatles' partnership. To the public and his former bandmates, this seemed like the ultimate act of betrayal. But Paul's motivations were more complex than they appeared. Years later, Paul revealed that the lawsuit was actually his attempt to protect the Beatles' legacy from Alan Klein, whose business practices he deeply distrusted. I had to fight, and the only way I could fight was in suing the other Beatles, because they were going with Klein, Paul explained. History would vindicate Paul's instincts. Klein was eventually fired by the other Beatles in 1973, and they came to understand that Paul's suspicions had been justified all along. George Harrison later acknowledged this with characteristic understatement. Everybody's sued each other to their heart's content, and now we're all good friends. The tragedy of this period is that the man who worked hardest to preserve the Beatles' unity was the one forced to shoulder the blame for their dissolution and endure years of public vilification for making the difficult decision that ultimately protected their musical and financial legacy. The story of Let It Be could have ended with bitterness and legal battles, but instead it transformed into something far more powerful. The song that was born from Paul's personal grief and became a lightning rod for the band's conflicts ultimately transcended its painful origins to become exactly what Paul had envisioned in his mother's dream, a source of comfort in times of trouble. Paul has performed Let It Be at some of the most emotionally significant moments of the past several decades. He played it at Live Aid in 1985, bringing 72,000 people at Wembley Stadium and 1.9 billion television viewers together in a moment of unity. He performed it at benefit concerts for disaster victims, turning his personal hymn into a collective prayer for healing. Most poignantly, Paul sang Let It Be at his wife Linda's funeral in 1988, bringing the song's origin story full circle. The ballad that had been inspired by his mother's spiritual presence became his farewell to another woman who had been the center of his world. The song's greatest test came in the aftermath of September 11, 2001, when a grieving world desperately needed exactly the message of hope and acceptance that Let It Be offered. In that moment of collective trauma, Paul's deeply personal song became a universal anthem, proving its power to unite people across all boundaries of nationality, religion, and politics. The irony is profound and beautiful. The song that tore the Beatles apart became the vehicle through which they achieved their greatest legacy. Let It Be proved that true art transcends the circumstances of its creation, that beauty can emerge from pain, and that sometimes the most personal expressions become the most universally meaningful. Let It Be stands as perhaps the most complex song in popular music history. A tender lullaby born from a mother's love, forged in the fires of artistic conflict, and transformed into a timeless anthem of hope. It represents everything that made the Beatles extraordinary: their ability to channel personal pain into universal healing, to create beauty from chaos, and to touch the human heart with simple, profound truth. What part of the Beatles' story surprised you? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more stories of rock's greatest hits.